Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you're coming from today. Welcome to the final Fair Farms webinar of 2023. I'll move a little closer, I'll speak a little louder. Today, we're going to take a bit of a deep dive into the concepts, practices, and policies around diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, these slides are fairly information heavy, and I apologise in advance for this kind of death by PowerPoint approach. I wouldn't normally do this, but don't worry if you don't pick it all up today, because as always, the presentation will be recorded and made available, so you can always revisit. That's the whole point. And of course, our Fair Farms team members can be contacted at any time for additional advice and assistance. So welcome everybody. It's great to have you on board. As always, the first thing we do is acknowledge the stories, tradition and living cultures of the First Nations peoples on the lands on which we meet today. We recognise their connection to land and environment and celebrate their care for country for over 60,000 years. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and we value their skills and knowledge as our first horticulturalists. Okay, so there's a lot of talk about diversity these days, and we tend to think mostly about diversity in terms of ethnic diversity or gender diversity, but it's actually a bit bigger than that, and this is why it's a bit of a deeper dive. Diversity is actually also a generational thing. And it's also important to have diversity in how people think. I mean, thankfully, we don't all think the same way and do things in the same way. Otherwise, there would never be innovation, creativity. So it's important to have, some diversity in your workplace in terms of people who think sometimes outside the box or slightly differently, back to front, all those kinds of things. So today we're going to look at all types of diversity, all types of people and all kinds of minds. So in a nutshell, diversity, equity and inclusion are three very closely linked values that work to support different groups of individuals. So including people of different races, ethnicities, religions, abilities, genders, sexual orientations and generational as well as even neurodiverse. So in a nutshell, that's what we're talking about today. It's what about makes each of us unique, our backgrounds, our personality, our life experiences, our beliefs, systems, the things that actually make us who we are. And that can include an infinite range of individual and unique characteristics to us. Communication style, the kind of career path we seek out, our life experiences, whether we travel extensively or not, educational background, even friendships and relationships within our communities. Geographical location will have an impact. Income levels, marital status, parental status, all these variables influence personal perspectives. So it's a combination of those differences that shape our view of the world and our perspective and our approach. And that's how we place meaning in the world. So it's a little kind of esoteric and highfalutin, but it's also about actually just acknowledging that diversity exists in the world and in our smaller mini worlds of workplaces. So it's about recognising, respecting and valuing those differences, whether they're based on ethnicity, gender, age, religion, race, disability or sexual orientation. So that's the first thing about diversity. The second thing, though, we want to talk about, and I think it's useful to have this conversation now, we all have it to some extent, unconscious bias. It kind of refers to the automatic associations or reactions that arise when we encounter a person or a group. And generally, instead of kind of maintaining this neutrality, we tend to associate, or we can associate negative and positive stereotypes with certain groups. And these biases can sometimes take over our brains. And I'm sure we've all been there at some point. We are by definition unaware of those biases that affect our decisions and judgments. And this is why they're called unconscious biases. So perhaps an example, and a really simplistic one, is if you hear the word nurse, what immediately pops into your mind? And probably a large proportion of people would say a female. So, you know, that is a really basic illustration of perhaps an unconscious bias. If you think about a mechanic, if you think about a chef, if you think about, you know, any number of occupations, where does your head go when you think about, you know, who that person might be? So because it operates beneath our levels of awareness, it can be challenging to acknowledge that you actually have those biases and to manage those biases. But the first step is also recognition, you know, kind of recognition that you have them. Okay, and just an example of some of these kind of cognitive distortions that can happen. And if you think about it, you could probably recognize some of these in yourselves. And again, that's often the first step. If you recognize it in yourself, you may be able to recognize it in others and adjust situations accordingly. But things like catastrophizing, so everything is, you know, terrible. It's all bad. It's never going to be good again. Mind reading, kind of assuming that you think you know what other people are thinking. And I think we've all been there. So we're making assumptions or presumptions about what people might be thinking about us or about a particular situation. Negative focus, so, you know, sad sacks and people who just think the world is a terrible place and it's never going to get better. Control fallacy, I like this one. This is this idea that you somehow have control over the situations that you clearly do not have control over. And I know a lot of us probably have that, you know, believing that we need to control things, you know, keep them, you know, under. And it's really what we do in a business sense. That's, you know, it's what this is all about, is establishing these systems that allow us to put some controls in place. But in thought processes, it's not particularly helpful because we know in truth that we don't control the world around us to any great extent. Personalisation, so taking things personally, and there's a whole range of those, and I'll let you have a look at those, you know, when you get this this presentation. So I think it's useful. These are useful to understand, you know, some of the kind of tricks that your mind will play on you. And once you recognise again in yourself, then you begin to understand what you need to do to ensure that these things don't run the show for you. So if you're having conversations with people and just because you don't do it this way or they would prefer to do it a particular way, you need to be mindful that, you know, you're listening, understanding and giving them an opportunity to actually demonstrate whether a different way would work or work better. Okay, so just a really brief thing on those cognitive distortions. Okay. Now, in this conversation, we're often talking about equity and equality, and whilst they're similar in nature, they're kind of different in their outcomes, and that's the key word here is outcomes. So equity generally refers to fair treatment for all people, so that the norms and the practices and the policies that you have in place at your workplace ensure that identity is not predictive of outcomes or opportunities. So that is that, you know, if only, you know, middle-aged white men get promoted to managers, but your workforce makeup is 65% people of non-white origin, then you would be having a little think about how does that reflect diversity in your workplace and how could you do that better? I'm not saying that you're not going to appoint on the basis of merit, but these are just things you bring into your thought processes when you're thinking about this stuff. So equity differs from equality in a subtle but a fairly important way. And that image, and it comes in various forms, is the obvious one. So while equality assumes that everybody should be treated the same, equity actually takes into consideration an individual person's unique circumstances and adjusts the treatment or the operation or the practice accordingly so that the end result is equal. It's all well and good to have equal input, but what we're looking for is equitable outcomes. And sometimes we need to make adjustments, you know, for people to ensure that they have an opportunity to contribute their best and their most. So that's your equity versus equality. And the third wheel of this, or perhaps the fourth wheel, is about inclusion. So if diversity is about actually acknowledging and valuing the differences, inclusion actually occurs when people feel and they are actually valued and respected in their workplace, and that's irrespective of, their personal characteristics or their backgrounds or their circumstances. It means that they have an opportunity to fulfill their individual and combined potential. They have access to all the opportunities and resources, the same as everybody else. They can contribute their personal best in every encounter. And again, this is where differences of how one might work might come into play. If someone's not doing something the way it's always been done, the question is, does it work, and does it work better? So they can contribute perspectives and talents to improve practices and even, the business itself, bring more of themselves to their jobs. So you're looking at things like improved morale, improved productivity, improved performance, which leads to potentially improved profitability, which is what we're all about. And of course, that thing about having a sense of belonging. So, workplaces, we spend enormous amounts of time in our workplaces, more probably than any other place that we spend when we take into consideration everything that we do over any 7-day period. So, that kind of sense that you're welcome and included and belong in this workforce is an important kind of outcome. Okay, I just want to take a look at some of the diversity at Australia's population diversity. And I think this is as of 2021. So, we're talking about having people from over 200 different countries. We're talking about 200 plus different languages spoken in Australian homes. 1 in 4 people in Australia now were born overseas. We have 50 or more Indigenous languages spoken, and that will be growing as these languages are revived. We have 11 in 100, so 11% are diverse sexual orientation or gender identity. We have 4.2 million people operating with disabilities and 3.5 million who are hearing impaired. And we have a 2.2% per year increase in Indigenous population growth. So if we're looking at a diverse kind of country, Australia ticks the boxes, as does many other countries. But certainly these are reflected in our everyday lives, these kind of statistics, whether we know it or not. So we have an estimated Indigenous population, almost to 1 million now, about 955,000 or so. So it's a little under 4%, but that is growing as well. So again, sticking closer to home, it's important that you consider Indigenous matters and how you can improve situation for your local communities through workplace, opportunities and training. Okay, where are we? So again, just a bit of background. We're going to head into sort of generations at this point, because I think it's really, really useful to think about it. I hadn't thought about it until I started looking at the differences and then started applying it to my own family. And my goodness, how true it is. So essentially, migration's been really central to Australia's national story. In times of change, crisis, it's helped Australia tackle all our national challenges and build long periods of prosperity and security for all of our citizens. Following the Second World War, so what we see here is that decline between the world wars. But following the Second World War, it was a kind of populate or perish approach, laying the foundations for the post-war boom. And what we see then from 47 up through to about 1971, probably 73, was a massive increase in immigration to the country. But that was essentially the White Australia policy. So that was largely immigrants from the UK, Britain, Ireland, Canada, and pretty much Commonwealth countries. The White Australia policy, of course, is a period of great shame, but nonetheless, it is part of our history. And what we see is it kind of even out then over this period, and then we see this increase from about 2006 to 2007. And you can link that growth and those declines to world events. There's no question about it, which is why the world begins to get more interesting the further along we go, when you look at, the national kind of, or the global situation. As I said, we have a history, and not a very good one in this, but I think it's worthwhile recognising it. The White Australia policy encapsulated, this kind of set of racist and historical policies. that aim to forbid people of non-European, essentially, ethnic origin emigrating to Australia. So you can look into that as much as you want to. It's useful to have that history, and we always acknowledge our history. However, governments progressively dismantled this policy between 49 and 73, but it wasn't really until, you know, those migration numbers started growing around here in the early 70s that policy was probably fully dismantled. I'm not suggesting, however, it didn't continue to operate in some unconscious fashion for the years to come. Now, top 5 countries of birth in Australia, this is as at 2021. England is 3.6% or proportion of the population. India, 2.6%. China, 2.2%. New Zealand, 2.1%, our neighbours to the south, and the Philippines, 1.2%. Now, they're just the top 5. Clearly, there are another 200 nationalities represented in those stats, but it's interesting to see, if you think about what those numbers looked about, you know, even 50 years ago, they would look very, very different. So again, gives us a bit of an idea of our population. Now, this is just for interest's sake, and in fact, I don't think it's particularly useful, because what I'd realised is they'd really stopped putting any thought into how many migrants, net migrants, they might increase over the next, you know, 20 or 30 years, because they've simply put 139,991 in every year. So not particularly useful, but what it does show is at least in this, is a slowing down of population growth, irrespective of an increase in the number of migrants. So apparently Australians, we're not having enough babies. Okay, now we want to talk about my generation. It's just another kind of diversity, and we must have all as parents and grandparents. Well, perhaps not as grandparents. We tend to be a bit more liberal, don't we? But as parents, certainly kind of shook our head and going, I just don't understand how this kid thinks. I can't work it out. So when you begin to kind of delve into how, you know, minds work and the kind of things that influenced minds when they were growing up, it has a lot to say about the kinds of people we turn into, and it's just the way that society has developed and grown. So the greatest generation, born 1901 to 1927, that was my parents' generation. The silent generation, that was post-World War I and into World War II. Baby boomers, 46 to 64, that is me. Generation X, 65 to 80, millennials or Gen Y, 81 to 96, that's my son. Generation Z or iGen, although I've never heard that term, born 1997 to 2012, and Gen Alpha, born after 2000. So those are young'uns who are, you know, probably in their early to mid-teens and a little bit older by now. So that's a bit of a picture. This is kind of the population by generation with... I don't quite know. This is also from 2021. So again, this just kind of represents the kind of, if you're looking at how many people do you employ who are between the ages of, you know, 18 and 40, then Gen Z and Gen Y, those millennials, that's going to be of particular interest to you. So baby boomer values, and I'm going to, again, because you're going to be receiving this and because I'm going to run out of time, these are the kind of values that are instilled. And during this time, it was a time of significant social change, economic prosperity and technological advancement. So between 46 and 64, we literally went from riding horses to school to the first computers. So reinvention was a major kind of value. Youthfulness, knowledge, they really valued continuing to learn and to try new things. Hard work, boomers have often been described as workaholic generation, and I can certainly vouch for that throughout my, you know, 30s, 40s and 50s. Individualism, optimism. Despite facing significant social and political upheaval, they've remained remarkably optimistic. I suspect that has something to do with their economic prosperity. and family, which is incredibly important to most generations, but became something of a highlight apparently for boomers. Let's look at Gen X, 1966 to 1980. Diversity, equality and justice, and this is where we really see these kinds of concepts and these notions coming into play in a conscious way in the minds of the people born between these years. Work-life balance and the belief in that technology was actually going to make life better. Informality and apathy. Apathy is often seen as a negative word, but I think a better word might be a discernment, and that's kind of understanding what might be important as opposed to what is not. So this is probably a generation that, you know, had the beginnings of some of the psychological, you know, trainings and benefits, etc. They were really the first generation raised by working mothers as well. And now that's going to have an impact on your values. Gen Y, flexibility at work. Collaborating with a wide range of different people. So again, seeking out diversity in who they work with. Millennials value and understand the benefits of technology. They want to have an impact. So it's important to them that what they do is meaningful, both to them and even more to the world. So while they value their own well-being, what's important is that they are doing something that is meaningful. And interestingly, the other comment was that millennials often value having a pet more than having children. So I thought that was interesting. Gen Z, 1997 to 2010. Again, diversity and inclusion is important. It now becomes number one. So what we're talking about, what's 2010? So 13, 23, 24, this stuff becomes really important. And I suspect that that's because they have now been exposed to a lot more diversity, given the diversity in the growth of Australia's population. And they have been taught, as they have been exposed more and more to diverse cultures, etc., that inclusion is a really important element of, you know, our values. Individual expression and avoiding labels. So again, that kind of sense of individuality and showing off their own style. They don't believe perfection exists. I agree with them. Making decisions and relating to institutions in a highly analytical and pragmatic way. And if you've ever had a formal kind of conversation with someone this age, you'll understand that. You know, it is the why, it is the why not, it is but what about, it is what if, it is, well, I don't agree. So, you know, those are often, and I'm kind of paraphrasing from my own experience here, you'll have your own. Okay, the babies of the group, influenced by their millennial parents and their Gen Z role models, they are characterised by strong ethics and values. Now, it is perhaps a little early to tell with, what are we talking here, perhaps, you know, 13 to 15-year-olds. But I think even certainly by the time, you know, they're 15, they have a strong sense of it. Now, while some of that comes from family, a lot of it, I imagine, also it comes from outside. So it's going to come from their educational environment, their social environment, and they're online so much these days too. So that's the other, you know, really kind of heavy duty thing here. So they're tech savvy. They're known as the digital natives. The internet has always been a part of their life, and they wouldn't know what to do with a rotary phone if you handed them one. They are diverse and globally minded, and they're looking for representation and inclusivity themselves. Now, I think that probably is a reflection of their youth, and like all young people, feel like they're not being heard. But nonetheless, I thought that was interesting. And again, helping people. We have this kind of move, perhaps as we've moved more into the service industries away from manufacturing, as we move more into service industries, etc. Not to mention 21st century stress means that service industries, and particularly service industries focused on helping people, you know, are a top priority. And there's somewhere a 2019 report that said about 60% would like to work somewhere saving lives in some capacity. And when they're asked how they introduce themselves as a gamer. So I know nothing about gaming, gamification of, you know, training and workplace things like that. However, this is the generation that does. So if you're not with the program, you better get with the program. The other thing I just want to mention here, which is becoming more and more, is coming more to the fore, like all, kind of diversity, is neurodiversity. And you may or may not have heard the term, but it's a term used to describe differences in the way that people's brains work. It's a bit of a cover-all term and can describe a whole range of experiences and situations and characteristics. But it's the idea that individual people experience and interact with the world around them in many, many different ways, that there's not one right way of thinking. Remember, we said earlier, I don't understand how they think. It's not a right way of thinking and a wrong way of thinking. It's just another way of thinking. It's a different way of thinking. So it recognises that everyone has a unique brain, and therefore they also have different skills, different abilities and different needs, and they also do things differently. They might do it differently. So recognising and accepting neurodiversity in the workplace is about embracing and encouraging these differences. And there we're talking about, ADD, so attention deficit disorder. How would you actually work with, an 18-year-old young person who presents to your workplace with that kind of ability? And we call them abilities because that's, we're going to turn all this on its head. People who've been through trauma, they may show different reactions to loud noises or particular activities. Sensory integration disorder, so people who can't handle lots and lots of loud noises, you're going to put them in the machine shed, Anyway, so you have a think about around that spectrum there, and whether or not you might have people like this, because a lot of this isn't obvious. People do well to hide a lot of this because that's what they've been told to do and taught to do, because it has been a disability and not seen as conducive to a harmonious or, productive workplace. Not so. You just have to find different ways of doing it. Remember, we all think differently. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit around about implementation. So we're talking about what it is. Well, what does it mean? So first, I just want to talk a little bit about the protected attributes, or they might be called protected characteristics. So these are certain personal characteristics that are protected by law from discrimination. So the protected attributes under the Fair Work Act and Australia's various anti-discrimination law include these in the green box here. So race, colour, sex, sexual orientation, age, religion, physical or mental disability, marital status, family or carer responsibility, etc., etc. And it now includes political opinion and social origin and gender identity and intersex status, etc. So there's a whole set of protected attributes. If an employee or potential employee can demonstrate that they were denied some benefit or outcome because you discriminated on the basis of any of this, then you're going to have to answer to those allegations. And this is why we ask you to be proactive in this, because this can often go on with people. It might not be you. You may completely agree and happy to write and initiate this policy, but you also need to make sure that your supervisors and your trainers understand these policies as well, so that they're not breaching them. So those are the protected attributes. And hey, vive la différence, realise the benefits. So before you go into thinking about how hard this is going to be or how much it's going to cost, just have a think about how it could actually benefit by valuing your workplace inclusion diversity. We see benefits. You will see benefits, and yes, measurable ones. You have improved employee engagement and wellbeing. So employees are seen and heard, and are included. There's better retention. You will keep people longer if you see them. There's improved performance. They will give you as much as you give them and more if they feel that they are valued as an individual. Increased innovation. People who are happy at work have great ideas sometimes. And we've, again, often said that listening to employees' ideas, particularly around things like work health and safety or, some innovative practices, is a real good opportunity to hear a different set of ideas. Minimise the risk of unlawful behaviour. So, you minimise bullying. And yeah, you say there is a practice, you say there is a process, you say that that we want people to complain if it's happening, and any examples of it, will be dealt with. and you know, we're going to make a stand on this. If this is the kind of behaviour you want to exhibit at work, then you're perhaps not going to be working with us for very long. And it also is, you know, being an employer of choice. You know, as well as I do, that backpackers in particular talk. They talk on Facebook, they talk on all social media, and they talk amongst themselves. And if you're, you know, in their minds, you know, not a fair and reasonable employer or a good employer, they'll tell their friends. So it becomes a bit of market demand, supply and demand issue. So these are the reasons why we're looking at it. But put some planning behind it. So, you know your people, do a little exercise, understand the gender breakdown, the culture, what kind of linguistic diversity you've got in your workforce. We have some of the most culturally diverse workforces in the country. You know, given the nature of the seasonal work, the seasonal worker programs and the working holiday maker programs. So get some data about your workplace. Develop a policy. It's not difficult. It doesn't need to be lengthy. You don't need to write War and Peace here. It is a statement of commitment. It is how you're going, how you see your world at your workplace, your expectations about conduct and behaviour, and how you will deal with issues should they arise. Think about some actions, training, toolbox meetings, National Day celebrations, even basic language classes. You know, there's no reason why you can't, you know, let's do half a dozen basic phrases in Tagalog, this toolbox meeting or something. See if you can measure and review. There's always an opportunity to improve. And again, be a bit creative. Now, I put this in, and it's not to frighten you. It's really just to say this kind of diversity and inclusivity, equity and equality kind of policy. There's already a number of policies that you're going to either have in place, or the question about whether or not you could incorporate some of the key principles around diversity and inclusion into a overarching, you know, code of conduct or statement of ethic operations and employee relations. So I'm just saying you should have an ethics and integrity kind of code of conduct. So you should have some policy statement that talks about your business ethics, that talks about your employment ethics, you know, that you operate within the law, that you are, you know, and within the various acts that are covered, that you're covered by, so including the Anti-Slavery Act. And then, you know, that you set your expectations around conduct. You should include a statement around free and voluntary employment, and that is that, you know, you're not holding people against their will, you're not holding onto people's passports or their shoes, or, you know, that there's a right for them to leave voluntarily when they want to, a right to belong or not to a union, and freedom to collectively bargain. You will have a discrimination, bullying, harassment policy and procedure. Again, that deals with, you know, it makes a statement about zero tolerance to those types of behaviours, and may set out some expected behaviours, and then procedures for managing grievances that come under that policy. And then your general grievance and dispute procedure. It's really important to have one of these. You've got to have one, but they're really useful. If there's a problem that you don't feel like you can solve in half a day with a couple of phone calls or a conversation, then you might need to be looking at something a bit more serious, which just gives you some structure. And if you have it and they have it, then we know which direction we're heading in. Procedures for communicating with non-English speaking workers. So again, that might be a statement, you know, how do you get across that really important work health and safety and workplace information, whether it's through, you know, multiple language resources, video, photographs, interpretive dance, however you'd like to deliver, you know, is fine, but outline how that works. And then, of course, the diversity, equity and inclusion policy and practices. So, you know, at some point, I think we'll probably take a look at these and see how they might be reasonably structured into, you know, if not one, then certainly a smaller number of policies for you to consider. Okay. So we're going to make a statement. We're going to write a statement that outlines your commitment to equality, and to state that your aim is to create a workforce that is diverse, that promotes positivity and allows everyone to thrive no matter their backgrounds or characteristics. You need to clearly state that your business will not discriminate on the grounds of any protected characteristics, and that a policy and procedures exists to address any problems with that. You need to outline the type of work environment you aim to create. As I said before, we aim to create a workplace free of discrimination and prejudice that allows everyone to bring their authentic selves to work. And state that when selecting for employment or promotion or training or anything of this nature to do with employment, that it will be based on the individual's own potential and merit, attitude and capability will determine suitability for the role, not any personal characteristics. If a person in a wheelchair can do the job as good as a person not in a wheelchair, then positive discrimination is a really, good thing to have on hand. State that the policy is active. So that means if it's not working properly, we're going to change it. If we need to add to it, we're going to add to it. And if you recognise something that it's not working, then you need to let us go. So you need to monitor it and review it. And I've just included a link there from the Queensland Government that has a diversity and inclusion policy that might help you when you're seeking to write your own. Okay, I'm conscious that we are running a bit over time. I thought we might, but we've only got a couple more to go. So how about set up a diversity working group? I mean, if you have a consultative group already, inviting a few of your international workers onto it, so that you can bring a diverse viewpoint to some of those discussions would be a good idea. It's about building an inclusive and equitable environment. And those staff, I've said again, often the unique insights of staff can often help create a more, inclusive workplace, a safer workplace. And look, staff are required to commit to these policies and procedures in order for them to work. So it's important that you do that, kind of collaboration, and cooperation. So foster equity, collaborate on these strategies, raise and promote awareness, collaborate with management and supervisors. So, you're driving change in the workforce from the top down, and celebrate the diversity that you have in your workplace. Have a toolbox meeting, have a chat about unconscious bias. Remember we talked before, have a little chat about unconscious bias. It's probably, people don't think about it, intellectually very often, but a conversation about that kind of thing, have some draw cards or something, anything to make it a bit interesting over a 10 or 15 minute or 20-minute toolbox meeting. Have an employee share a story about their experiences as a member of a diverse workforce, outline your policies and procedures, have a young worker session. Get some input from those kids, get the input from the young'uns. They are our future. And have a think about other things that might apply at your workplace. Celebrate a national day with food and culture. These are all links to national days, and, some ideas about what you might be able to do on a national day. That's Diwali. So the dates are in there for the next couple of years. There's South Korea, Samoa, Vanuatu, Heroes Day at Timor-Leste, Chile, Canada and Belgium. And there's a whole heap more, just depending on what nationality your workers are from. We know a lot of growers who do this, and it looks like a load of fun. So we'll be seeking out growers who are promoting really inclusive activities and probably doing some stories on those guys. Okay, quick recap. So work to understand the key concepts of diversity, inclusion and equity. Understand how they might apply in your workplace. Think about it as a mutually beneficial arrangement, ways to improve productivity, dedication and morale for your workers, and productivity and profitability for you. Recognise your own unconscious bias and have conversations about it. It's no sin to acknowledge something that goes on in your head. It's the first chance you have to think about it and, either decide to get rid of it or not. Collect some data, know your workplace. So who's who in your zoo? Develop a policy statement around diversity and inclusion and ensure that you have a strong anti-discrimination policy in place and that you act on it when necessary. Develop some tools and activities to raise awareness and to promote inclusivity, and, learn about another culture. Give those cultures who work with you an opportunity to teach you about their culture, whether that's through National Food Days or celebration days or learning a sentence a week or, whatever it is. Have a think about it. Talk with you guys at work, and I'm sure that you'll be able to come up with some activities that will work really well for you. Okay. That one's it. So I really just want to say a great big heartfelt thank you for attending not only today's last webinar of 2023, but for your participation and engagement throughout the year. It means a lot to me. The numbers have varied, but I'm just really happy to be able to be delivering this information to you. So from all of us here at Fair Farms, we wish you a safe and a peaceful and a really, really happy festive season, however you do or do not celebrate it. We'll be back in 2024, bigger and brighter, and a few extra surprises for you. So keep an eye out early in January on our events page, and we'll be coming back next year bigger and brighter than ever. Merry Christmas. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in 2024. Bye for now.